Thank you all so much for coming to our training on our feedback loop. We're really excited to share both what we've put together for our own program and also some data that we've gathered recently. To get us started, I'm going to throw it over to Justin Myers, the CEO of For Our Future, to give us an intro here.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you, everyone that's joining us today. Certainly wish we could be in person in Denver, but of course, we all have to remain safe and healthy so that we can make sure that we kick this asshole out of office come November. So with that, I want to, for those who don't know, we just wanted to go into some brief background about For Our Future and then reintroduce the feedback loop to you since we did do a session on the feedback loop in 2018 or 2019, I believe, 2019 at Netroots on the feedback loop as well. So just to let folks know, we are an organization that is a permanent organizing entity. We exist in 7 states. We are in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Florida, and Nevada. And our model is one that is simple, and it's something that I think, we have been missing for a while now. Outside of our community organizations that are great on our side, and we are a C4 and a PAC, typically campaigns going to communities, on the hard side, they set up these wonderful organizing infrastructures that have little connection to the community, often do not hire from the community, and then right after election, they just pack up and leave. And we believe that that has created an instance in which a lot of the voters that we are speaking to, particularly those that are in marginalized communities, feel like we're treating their vote as a transaction. So we, For Our Future, and a number of the community partners that we work with throughout our 7 states, believe that it's really important that we continue to have that conversation with voters, not just around elections, but also when it's not an election cycle, when it's not an election year, to talk to them about the issues that matter to them, and then use those issues to actually organize around ultimately engaging these folks, walking them up the ladder of engagement, and mobilizing them and getting them to take that action, which is not the last action, but an action in our walk with them, which is voting. So what you'll see here on this slide is, of course, we have a permanent presence in all of our states. Because we have this permanent presence, we're able to hire directly from the community. So if you go to any of our states, you will see a staff that is very much reflective of the communities that we're in. We're a multi-issue driven organization. We have the ability to work on anything, whether it has to do with social justice, environment, education. We have the ability to really connect with voters on a number of different issues. We're also an organization, and I sit here in DC today, as does John, but we firmly believe that the Beltway, DC does not know best. We want to make sure that our strategy and our tactics and the messaging that is informing our program is coming from the ground up. And we firmly believe that we know that we are a state-centric organization that is driven by our state directors and our staff on the ground. Again, something that's really important to us, we like to start early and listen. We never stop listening to voters. After Election Day, we're going to continue to speak to community members and talk to them about the issues that matter to them. We're going to work with them to lift up those issues as budgets are being decided in state capitals, in DC and in City Hall, to make sure legislators know that their constituents are going to hold them accountable for the issues that are important to them. And last but not least, we seek to always meet voters where they are, which is why I'm so happy to have this discussion about how we have pivoted during COVID from an organization that was doing a lot of face-to-face organizing to digital organizing. So what you'll see in the next slide is partially how we have pivoted. On March 13th, we decided that we were going to cease face-to-face organizing. We were going to move directly to 100% telework and have our folks start to organize or continue that organizing in the virtual space. And it looks different in a lot of states. Some states, in all states, we're actually using phones. We're using peer-to-peer texting. We're using Facebook Messenger, where we can have conversations with community members. We're also using things like teletown halls, which you see here on your screen now, to organize around important issues. In Pennsylvania and Michigan alone, we were able to organize town halls with elected officials around the ACA and Trump's attempt to dismantle the ACA, particularly at a time when so many people are losing their healthcare coverage due to COVID and losing their job. And we drew thousands of folks to these town halls. And again, it gave us an opportunity to meet voters where they are, to speak to an issue that matters to them, engage them in a different way. And hopefully the next step in that relationship with these voters will be getting them to vote, whether it's vote by mail or voting in person, which we hope for the former, not the latter. And this leads me to the next important piece. We are going to play a pretty large role in vote by mail, and I can speak from personal experience. I grew up in Philadelphia. You can see I have my For Our Future PA shirt on right now. My elderly mom and dad, my dad's 86, my mom is 76. They both still live in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, in the house where I grew up. They have underlying conditions, I should say, that really make my family nervous about them going out into the public. So my brother and I were making a huge push with my parents to get them to vote by mail. And I think what we're seeing nationally is that you have a lot of people that are reticent to vote by mail, in particular, older African Americans that are reticent to vote by mail. And my brother and I were able to get through to them, and ultimately they did vote by mail. And one thing that we know that's going to be really important here, in order to cut through the disinformation that Donald Trump is sowing, whether it's him telling us that we can't rely upon vote by mail, that is fraudulent, whether it's the Russians doing their disinformation and whatever the craziness that they will engage upon, if it's Trump slowing down the United States Postal Service. We know that we're going to encounter a lot of hurdles here in making sure we are trying to bank as many votes as early as possible. To boot, we also know we have states like Michigan and Pennsylvania where vote by mail is newer and some education is going to have to be done. So we are committed to making sure that we are using our network of folks, whether it's our community partners that we work with, the community organizations, the staff that we're hiring from the community, or our relational voter leaders in our states that we recruit to volunteer to basically engage their networks of friends, family, and colleagues. We firmly believe that we're well situated to help with the education, generation, and chase, and to cut through this information through trusted and authentic messengers that know their communities, oftentimes look like their communities, know the issues that matter to them, and can speak to them in a different way about the importance of voting by mail during this particular pandemic. Next slide. Thank you so much. And then, the last but not least, and then I'm going to hand it over to John. The reason why we're here again is to talk about the feedback loop. We like to lead with issues, which is the most important thing for us. We believe that if we are using issues to motivate those that may not be motivated by our candidate, then we will be more successful. In 2018, one of the reasons why we actually created the feedback loop in 2018 is because we saw what happened in 2016, where our candidate did make some pieces of the Democratic coalition enthused. There's no doubt about that. But I think that we also saw that there were pieces that were not enthused. We saw undervote by African Americans in places like Detroit and Philadelphia. We also saw that we lost some persuasion in some suburban places like the Collar counties in Pennsylvania surrounding Philadelphia. So in an effort to kind of be that canary in a coal mine, to figure out if there's a lack of enthusiasm on the ground, to figure out if we're speaking to the right issues to motivate these kind of voters, we created the feedback loop question, which is basically, what issue do you, the voter or community member, want to see addressed in City Hall, in your state capital, or in DC? And we collect all this data in real time. We created a dashboard that allows for us to break up this issue data by demographic group and by region to see differences. And I'll just highlight one, and then I'm going to hand it over to John. One example of the differences and how this has really helped us comes from 2018 in Pennsylvania, again, where I'm from, selfishly. I will give an example of where I'm from. But if you look at Pennsylvania-wide, you will see that at one point in time, I believe, right before Labor Day, 3 of the top 5 issues were more education funding, local taxes, and dislike of Trump. But if you went into Philadelphia and spoke to a Black or brown voter, you would hear that the issues that they cared about were things like local blight, opioid abuse, more jobs. So For Our Future has the ability, when we go back to this, to that individual community member or voter and speak to them a second, third, in some instances a fourth time in the digital space, or if we ever get back to it, face-to-face organizing, we can connect the actual candidate that we are advocating for with that issue to show the voter that this particular politician can help address the issue that they told us was important. So we could say Governor Casey has this plan to address opioid abuse in North Philadelphia. Governor Wolf. Senator Casey has this plan to address local blight in North Philadelphia. We want to be very specific as possible in speaking to hyperlocal issues that we think will motivate voters, rather than listening to the smart people in the Beltway that are often creating paid media that is geared towards a more persuadable audience. And when they do get to mobilizing people, it's usually after Labor Day, which we just feel like is much too late. Next slide, John. So with that, I'll give it to John, and John can talk through some more of the feedback loop and what we've been hearing, particularly since we've moved to 100% digital organizing and phone organizing. I should note that since March 13th, we have made over 3 million we have made over 3 million attempts to speak to voters, and we have tens of thousands of issue responses across our states that are allowing us to figure out how we can make sure we're drawing that contrast between our opponents and the people that we're advocating for, especially at the top of the ticket with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. John?
Thanks, Justin. And thank you so much for that walkthrough. I think I'm super excited to talk to you all. I'm John Malloy. I'm our National Data and Analytics Director here at For Our Future and For Our Future Action Fund. And as Justin said, we are really focused on having a different type of communication and conversation with voters and community members who we're talking to. In especially a presidential election year, we often see scripts that start out with a candidate ID question or start out with a do you plan to vote question. In our case, we really want to keep that opening question open-ended and use it as an organizing tool. And that's what we see our feedback loop question as first and foremost, a way for our folks to build deeper, better relationships with folks in the communities that they're organizing in 365 days a year. It also generates strategic intelligence that's really helpful that Justin referred to, of the ways that has impacted our strategy and the ways that we've been able to work with partner organizations and with stakeholders to highlight and lift up the voices of folks in each of the communities that we're active in. So as Justin said, the question that we open with is very different. Right now, our feedback loop question it acknowledges a little bit of the chaotic times that we're in. We're actually opening our conversations by saying, hey, a lot has changed in the last few weeks in our communities. What's the biggest issue facing you and your community right now? With so much that's going on, with so many challenges that folks are finding in life because of COVID, because of the election, because of all sorts of instability, this helps us connect to what is the biggest thing that's on your mind. When we ask that question, when our organizers ask that question, our canvassers, our volunteers, we're not just saying, okay, give us an answer and we're going to move on from there. We train all of our folks on how to go deep on that question, on how to have a deep, engaging conversation, get specificity, make sure that we're really digging into the impact that has on somebody's life so that we can capture that, so that we can speak to that, and so that we can make sure that we're able to connect folks to how they can make their voice heard on that impact in government, in their communities, and make sure that we can make a change on those issues. So as Justin said, following 2016, we, along with many other groups, identified that there was a little bit of a gap in program, right? And some of that gap was the ability to translate the conversations that folks had at the doors into strategic information. In 2016, I was working at a different organization, a partisan organization, and in the debriefs, everybody was talking about how, well, gosh, we heard this in our field organizer debriefs or our canvasser debriefs, that people weren't super excited. But I think that a lot of places couldn't figure out how do you compare that information to polling. Right? If you have on one hand a statistical measurement of something that's saying, here's where Hillary Clinton is in the polls in this state, but you're also hearing these anecdotes about people not being engaged, it's hard to kind of line those up with each other. And so walking into 2018, we knew that our organizers were already having deep conversations with folks at the doors. We're gathering a lot of information in those conversations, but it was hard for us to figure out how to capture that and quantify that, right? Anecdotes are really difficult to compare to each other in terms of the scale. And so we needed to identify better ways to quantify that deep feedback, to identify who was not engaged, who was engaged. And so we adapted our field listening scripts in 2018 to start to capture this issue information in some more structured ways. Launching our feedback loop was a two-step process. For us, first, it was creating the data infrastructure. How are we actually going to capture this information? How are we going to be able to try to quantify this information? So we created a data infrastructure within our voter contact databases. And we also knew that we needed to train our staff on how to gather and track this information. Both of those pieces are vital when you're gathering this level of detail. Gathering 1 to 5 IDs or gathering volunteer yeses or come to this event is a fairly cut and dried process. But with this, we needed to make sure that folks knew how to go deeper and ask for more specificity. If somebody said, well, I'm worried about, other countries, or I'm worried about war, going deeper and saying, okay, well, what about that? Is there somebody who you know who's in the armed forces right now? And making sure we're drilling down a little bit deeper into that. When it comes to infrastructure, folks are saying, well, I'm worried about, the roads. Is that, that the roads are in bad shape? One of the things that we found in 2018 in Michigan is we were really early in figuring out that auto insurance was a huge issue with folks, because the auto insurance rates in Detroit are really high for liability only coverage. That wouldn't pop up in a poll, but we knew that from our conversations with voters and community members, and we were able to capture that and really speak to that. But that was reliant on the training that we were able to give folks and the culture that we built up around going deep into these conversations. So in creating the data infrastructure, we knew that folks were often connecting on these highly specific issues. They were coming up in conversation. We didn't want to lose that granularity. And so rather than capturing, healthcare versus social security versus education, the way you might, if somebody got a poll questionnaire and said, do you care more about healthcare or education? That's helpful for folks, I think, who are in the Beltway. But that's not super helpful to the lived experience of folks in these communities. We wanted to capture that granularity. And so we launched tracking very specific issues. We launched tracking over 60 specific issues. That number has grown significantly, actually, since then, as we've had additional conversations. But issues ranging from shale and severance taxes to Medicaid cuts to more school funding, better teachers, roads and bridges, all sorts of very specific issues that are coming up in the day-to-day lives of folks. As we had these additional conversations, organizers took notes in our voter contact tracking software, and we went through those notes and said, okay, what are the words that are popping up here? Let's add those as additional options on this question. Let's make sure that we're giving a place to quantify these additional conversations that are coming up. That's how auto insurance entered the mix. In 2018, we also had a lot of data on folks who were very worried about gun violence, especially in the wake of the Parkland shooting in Florida. And that information showing up in different ways in our data, we were able to use those notes, track that qualitative feedback we got from organizers, and turn that into something we could quantify and compare across the map of our entire universe. Structurally, we set this up as a band survey question. This is actually a screenshot of one of our active scripts right now in Florida. And so we actually track, currently we are at over 130 specific issues that might come up in a conversation. And when somebody is on a phone call, in this case, this is a virtual phone bank script, asking these questions, we're trying to drive down to something that's very specific here. You can see that we've got a ton of issues here. We have some fun with formatting, as you can see in our drop down here, because we have a character limit in VAN. But with good training and good documentation for folks, we're able to really support folks tracking great issues here. Finally, coming back to that training point, tracking these very specific issues also requires specific training. So first, we wanted to recenter these field listening practices in our conversations with our canvassers and our organizers and our volunteers, making sure that we were asking open-ended questions. We don't prime this question with anything else. We don't knock on somebody's door or at this point, make a phone call or send a text message and say, we really care about the ACA, what is the most important issue to you? Because we know that that's actually going to skew the results that we get. We want to make sure that we're coming to folks completely open-ended, completely objective, and getting a really good read on what folks care about. After that open-ended question, then we lean into encouraging and probing questions for specificity. So how does that look in your day-to-day life? What are some ways that that is impacting your family or your friends? Making sure that we're really capturing the full story there. And then we also want to make sure that we're able to train folks on how do we pivot that issue into an organizing ask, because we are also working to create change. We're not a polling firm. We are in these communities trying to create positive change for the communities in which we're organizing. And so connecting the very specific issue to an action that folks can take to create a change in their communities with us. With that information, then we're able to do a number of different things. For one thing, in that conversation, we can build a deeper and more authentic and more connected relationship with the voter or community member that we're talking to. And we don't vanish at the end of the election cycle. We're coming back in January and talking about, okay, there's legislation up right now that speaks to this issue. Will you sign your name to this petition? Will you, if we were doing in-person events, will you come to this rally, et cetera, so that we can make sure that we're plugging people into ways that they can make their voice heard. It also helps us improve our program, helps us develop talking points and pivot points on new or local issues. Shale and severance tax is a great example. Really big in Pennsylvania, not really big in other places, but making sure that we have provided folks with how to actually discuss this issue, how to make sure that folks feel heard on this issue and understand how that issue connects to a choice that's coming up down the road, whether that's legislative action or an election. It also helps us shift our targeting based off of how issue priorities are showing up and how receptive people are to messaging that we're using, right? If we're seeing issues come up like border security, that gives us some information on, it's not partisan information, but it gives us some information on the reach of certain opposition messaging on the issue of immigration. And that helps us shift our targeting and know maybe we should layer in another layer of contact on our message on immigration right now. And it also helps us understand community views and share those findings with partners. We're going to walk through some of the data that we share regularly with our partners and also with the public from our feedback loop data, which is, we view it as one of our duties is lifting up the voices of the folks who we're talking to in these communities. And this is one of the ways that we can do that. So I'm going to quickly turn and run through some of our recent findings from our data that we've gathered since June 2nd. It's worth noting here that we've actually had a few iterations of our feedback loop data. At this point, we have collected in total on feedback loop survey questions over 700,000 issue responses across our history as an organization. This year, since we went on to full-time telework, we've gathered nearly 30,000 responses from these conversations. And we anticipate gathering tens of thousands more as we proceed through the rest of this cycle. Through 2018 and 2019, our question to folks was, what's the most important issue to you and your community? When in early March, when the pandemic began to really hit all of our communities hard, we knew we had to respond to the moment that we were in. We knew that asking folks, what's the biggest issue to you and your community? The answer was going to be COVID-19, right? We needed to shift and adjust and make sure we're meeting people where they were. And so we shifted in March, April, and May, to asking folks instead, how is COVID-19 impacting you and your family? So for those 3 months, we gathered a lot of data on the very specific ways that the pandemic was impacting people's lives. And then at the end of May and the beginning of June, we shifted back to a broader frame, but we shifted back to a broader frame that also needed to encompass the situation that was happening in all of our communities around protest action and people standing up to fight for justice for George Floyd, for Ahmaud Arbery, for so many folks who were murdered by police. And so making sure we were providing a way for folks to have their voice be heard on that as well as the ongoing impact of COVID and the numerous other issues that are showing up in each of our communities. And so we've shifted back to this frame of what's the most important issue to you and your community right now. Since June 2nd, we've been engaging with mobilization and persuasion households in Florida, Michigan, Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And we've been reaching out, as Justin said, via phone and SMS since March 14th. We've also engaged in things like Zoom one-on-ones and all kinds of other great innovative organizing strategies. But the data that we're looking at here is sourced from that phone and SMS conversation. Since June 2nd, we've gathered 16,841 responses to this question. Of those conversations, 33% of our respondents are Black, 49% white, about half between the ages of 35 and 65, 1 in 5 under the age of 35, and 3 in 10 over the age of 65. Because we're asking this question within our universe, this is not a representative sample of people in each of our states. It's not even a representative sample of the people in each of the communities that we're organizing in. We're working with folks who we intend to drive to action. And so we're not doing a randomized sample. That means, as you can see in the gender split here, 64% of our conversations are with women, 36% are with men. That's not a representative gender breakdown of our communities, but that is of the universe that we're working with in these places. That universe is very important to creating change in each of these communities, and these voices are vital to understanding how to create change in this election. Nationwide, we've grouped all of those 130 plus issues into a number of issue categories. When we look at how those break out across this data set, by and large, the biggest impact that folks are feeling in their lives right now is around economic issues. Following that are issues around education, some very hyper-specific COVID impacts. It's worth naming here that we have COVID issues that pop up in the economy category and the education category, and in all of these categories. Our COVID category here is really things like, how is the government handling COVID? Or how are people in my community? Are people not reacting in the right way? Or should we reopen our society? That's what's fitting into that COVID category. General contains support and far more often lack of support for President Trump. Folks whose strongest issue is dislike of President Trump or like of President Trump. And then we also have some focus on healthcare, on rights, on jobs, on family, society, et cetera. When we look at how these issue categories have shifted over the last several weeks that we are looking at within this data set, we can see that actually right in the middle of July, we had a really big emphasis on education issues. The big mover there was actually COVID-related school closures and COVID-related distance learning. And that really was a major factor in our Florida conversations, as we'll dive into shortly. We can also see that in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a renewed focus on COVID impacts. And we've seen a much stronger focus on those general issues, most of which relate to President Trump. Looking at the specific issues as they've come up across our conversations, the number one issue that comes up in conversations with voters nationwide is the impact of COVID on the economy. That's a little bit broad, but we also want to note there are a lot of specific issues that we track on economic issues as well. This is the broad version. Somebody who says, you know, it's the economic impact of this pandemic is what fits into that box, as opposed to a very specific concern about, for instance, affording food or affording housing, both of which are also significant issues in our national conversation. We can also see that COVID school closures is playing a large role in conversations in each of the communities in which we're organizing, as is COVID distance learning. Dislike of President Trump is also very prominent in this data set. It's worth noting, we are a little surprised by this, and we'll dig into this a little bit later. Universal basic income has come up in a number of conversations with folks in our communities. And as we've noted, this is an open-ended question. We're not asking people how they feel about universal basic income. It's just coming up organically, which we think is really interesting at this point in the cycle and with the way that topic has been discussed in the political space. So we'll dive into more of those details here in a bit. I want to take a look at our state level breakdown of this data. As you can see, the majority of this data does come from our Florida conversations. Just under 11,000 of these conversations were in Florida. In our Florida conversations, the number one issue is COVID economic impact, but that is closely followed by COVID school closures and COVID distance learning, which have been very prominent on the minds of Florida community members in recent weeks. Dislike of President Trump is also very prominent in our conversations, as are the impacts of kind of our overall economic situation on small businesses. We see a very different issue profile in Michigan, where we see a strong focus on Black Lives Matter, on disliking President Trump. We do see ready to reopen in relation to COVID popping up in Michigan. It's worth noting that that has actually decreased in prominence in recent weeks. We saw that a little bit earlier in the summer, but that is not being brought up nearly as often right now in our Michigan conversations. In Nevada, we see a strong dislike for President Trump. We also see some big economic concerns. Nevada, folks can remember back to March, which might feel like 5 years ago, at least it does for me. But a lot of the early impact of COVID-19 was on the hospitality industry, which we all know is a huge part of the Nevada economy. And we saw that really dominating the conversation early in our COVID feedback loop data in Nevada, and we see that continued focus in this most recent set of data. Pennsylvania and Wisconsin both see dislike of President Trump as the number one issue on the doors, and that is a recent change. COVID economic impact was the number one issue in every single state for quite a while, really since March, but recently we've seen dislike for President Trump starting to edge that out in these critical states. We do see in Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that racism and Black Lives Matter are named in the top 5 issues in those 4 states out of the 5 that we have enough data to report out on. And those conversations have been relatively consistent, especially in Michigan. And so while we saw a large focus on that in early June, we have seen a slight continued focus in some groups in each of our states. When we look at the demographic breakout of these issues, this looks really static right now, right? And we see COVID economic impact as number 1, with almost everybody. COVID school closures is number 2. What I will name, though, is that because Florida makes up so much of this data, the special focus on COVID school closures and COVID economic impact is throwing off a little bit of this information. And so I want to actually draw some attention to our nationwide demographic view outside of Florida, where we still see a high prominence of COVID economic impact with everybody. With folks over 65, we do see dislike of President Trump edging out COVID economic impact. But in the issue number 2 slot, we see a far higher focus on dislike of President Trump amongst pretty much all groups. The exception here is Latinx folks, for whom job and income loss is number 2 and recession is number 3. When we look at our age groups, we do see that folks under 35 are naming Black Lives Matter as their number 2 issue and dislike Trump as number 3. So still a very consistent focus on dislike of President Trump outside of Florida. I got a question in the Q&A here, a question about, is dislike of Trump coming up just from the mobilization universe, or is it also coming up in persuasion? That's a great question. We're seeing it come up mostly in our mobilization universe. We, at this point in the calendar, have been primarily engaging with our mobilization and activist universe and with some persuasion conversations, but this is not just within our mobilization universe. We are seeing this come up in our persuasion conversations as well, but I would say it's more focused within our mobilization and activist universes. And then I also want to note, there is another question that we got that I want to come back to when we get back to the Q&A section to talk about drop boxes in the election, but just for the person who asked that, we will absolutely come back to it. Looking nationwide at our top recent issue groups, I want to call out some of the trends that we see amongst different demographic groups looking at the issue categorizations. When you look at the specific issues, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to see the forest for the trees. But we can see that there is a strong focus on economic impacts across the board, but especially strong with Latinx voters. We also see a strong focus on education impact kind of across different age groups, which is important if we think about the fact that you might think that COVID school closures is mainly impacting parents. We're also seeing it show up a lot with folks over the age of 55, a little bit less with folks under 35. But it just names that this is also a really salient issue for grandparents as well as for parents and for folks who are just concerned about their community in general. Those COVID school closures have a big impact across our entire community. So I want to do a couple of quick issue deep dives. I want to start by diving in quickly into economic issues here. Looking at our economic issues, we can see that COVID economic impact is number 1 across the 5 states that we're in. We see a very strong focus on recession in a number of states, but we also see a number of folks bringing up affordability of housing and affordability of food in this moment in our universes. Universal basic income is coming up as a top 5 issue in Florida and in Michigan conversations, a little bit more prominently in our Florida conversations. When we look at our demographic breakout here, we can see that universal basic income is showing up more with Black voters. It's showing up more with voters between the ages of 45 and 54 and 55 and 64 for some reason. But we're also seeing a strong focus on small business issues across a number of groups. Whereas we might usually think of small business issues as a conservative issue, we see this as showing up as folks who are worried about the impact of the pandemic and our economic situation on their local businesses and their local economy. Diving into issues related to COVID, as I said, these are very hyper-specific to COVID issues that we're grouping under this categorization. One of the most important pieces I want to pull out here is that we see, in general, a lot of alignment around negative views of the federal and presidential response to COVID-19. But in Florida, we see a negative response to Governor DeSantis's handling of COVID-19, and that's really important for this election, right? We do see that there's a strong focus in Florida on that state government handling. We also see a number of folks who have, names that they're worried about people who are underreacting to COVID or not taking it seriously. And in Nevada and in Wisconsin, we see some folks who aren't thrilled with social distancing, and I would maybe like to get their social lives back on. But we're seeing that come up a little bit less now than we did in the early days of tracking that specific issue. We also see in Pennsylvania that the number one COVID-related impact that's named is the impact of COVID on communities of color. And that's really important, and we'll dive into some of the demographics on that as well. We can see that COVID impact on communities of color is coming up with Asian voters and with Latinx voters as well. When we look at the demographic breakout here, we do see a little bit more consistency across groups, with people underreacting to COVID as one of the major priorities across all age groups, and folks who are not ready to reopen coming up a whole lot as well. Diving into education, which is another huge focus across all of our states, or across our national data set at least, we see that 29% of our responses in Florida are really focused on some sort of education impact here. We see that drowns out really what we see in our other states. In Florida, we see a strong focus on the COVID education impacts. That's what we see in most states, but in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, we see longer term issues like more school funding or access to education outranking COVID distance learning, the number 2 COVID impact on education. When we look at the demographic breakouts here, we see a little bit more consistency, and this is largely because of the prevalence of that Florida data set, kind of drowning out some of the other states' information. Next, I want to walk through some data that we've collected from 3 of our states that I want to highlight quickly here, and then we'll have some time at the end here for questions as well. So I want to start by talking through our Michigan data, where we've engaged in 1,325 conversations. 56% of those were with Black community members, 36% with white community members, 62% with women. 55% of those conversations were with folks between the ages of 35 and 65. When we look at the top issue groups in our Michigan data set, we see the economy is number 1, but close behind are COVID impacts. These are things like ready to reopen or not ready to reopen, how people are handling COVID-19, et cetera. We also see a strong prominence of issues around rights and society showing up in our Michigan data. These are issues like Black Lives Matter and racism showing up. We see dislike for Trump ranking highly with this general category as well. When we look at some of the change in these issues over time, we saw a slight decrease in the focus on COVID-19 towards the tail end of July, but we've seen a lot of those impacts show back up in recent weeks. This may be connected or correlated with some slight increases in cases in Michigan, or coverage of that at least. We also see a recent increased focus on education impact in our Michigan data set, and that has generally been viewed similar. I think it's essentially taking a little bit away from the focus on economic issues. We see those as hand in hand. Folks who are naming education impacts are also naming the impacts of COVID school closures and their ability to work, on their ability to manage childcare, et cetera. And so rather than seeing these as entirely separate categories, it's a little bit more of like, what is the initial impact on folks' lives? When we look at some of the distinct issues that have come out of our Michigan conversations, we can see that COVID economic impact is absolutely number 1, but we see a strong focus on Black Lives Matter, on dislike of President Trump, on police brutality, on a relatively strong debate on whether Michigan is ready to reopen. As I noted, that ready to reopen category has gone down in some of the recent weeks as the focus has left a little bit of that conversation in Michigan. When we look at some demographic breakouts of our conversations in Michigan, we can see that COVID economic impact is the number 1 across all of these groups. We also see a very strong focus on Black Lives Matter with every single group except for Latinx voters, who do name racism as the number 3 issue that is impacting their lives and their communities. It's worth noting that affording food is coming up with Latinx voters in Michigan. We are seeing some focus on dislike Trump, number 3 amongst all conversations. That's driven a little bit more in Michigan by men than women. And we also see amongst men police brutality coming up in conversations as well. When we dive into the issue groups across demographic categories, we can see Similar to our national view, a relatively consistent focus on education across our age groups over the age of 35, with a slightly lower focus amongst folks under the age of 35. Strongest focus on economic issues with Hispanic voters, and a stronger focus on COVID and healthcare issues in folks over the age of 65. When we look at our Wisconsin data, out of 1,493 conversations, 79% are with white community members. Just under 50% were with folks between the ages of 35 and 65. 66% of our conversations in Wisconsin were with women. Wisconsin has an even more different kind of issue group profile. We're able to see that there's a pretty close race for top two issue groups here. COVID at number one with 22.6%, economic issues at number two with 22.1%. We also see a much higher focus on those general issues, which contain sentiments about President Trump, and on healthcare issues in our Wisconsin data set than we saw in a couple of the other states. Looking at this over time, we've seen a strong growing focus on COVID-19 impacts over the recent weeks, a relatively consistent focus on economic impacts, and also a strong growing focus on general, which is generally the change agent there is, again, sentiments towards President Trump. Healthcare has been relatively consistently significant in our conversations in Wisconsin, and we've seen a decreased focus on society and rights issues, which largely in the earlier parts of this data collection window were racism and Black Lives Matter issues. When we look at this data set at the individual issue level, we can see that while COVID economic impact is still very significant, we also see a very strong focus on dislike of President Trump, as was noted in our state-by-state breakout a little bit earlier. We see a strong focus on racism, on recession, on people underreacting to COVID, on negative views towards Trump's response to COVID-19. We also see a strong focus on personal COVID risk as a major healthcare issue here. And that correlates a little bit to having a slightly older universe in Wisconsin than we have in some of our other states, but it's still notable here. This is also a state where stress and anxiety came up as an issue that folks named in conversations as well. When we dive into some of the demographic groups in our Wisconsin data set, we can see that dislike of Trump is number one, but we see racism coming up most often amongst Black voters, Latinx voters, and voters under the age of 35. We do see that focus then coming in at number 4 in our overall issue ranking. Police brutality is the number 2 issue mentioned by Black voters who we spoke to in Wisconsin. And when we look at our top issue groups, we see a stronger focus on healthcare and COVID amongst voters over the age of 65. So with that, actually with 5 minutes left in our panel here, I'm actually going to go ahead and throw out to some questions here and see if folks have questions. And to go ahead and get us started, I'm actually going to say we have this question about the role of ballot drop boxes in this election. And so, Justin, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I would say yes. We're thinking through a number of ways through which we can help direct folks on where they can vote. So yes, if drop boxes are in a locality and we can ensure that they are safe for our folks, we will certainly push them towards those drop boxes. In places like Pennsylvania, I know that there's an active discussion about using public places that are in each neighborhood, and particularly in places like Philadelphia, i.e. libraries, as places where drop boxes can be prevalent, and we can use them, or voters can use them, I should say. So yes, I think everything's on the table for us as long as we can make sure that voters have the ability to vote safely and securely. We want to be able to push them towards those different mechanisms for voting.
Great. And yes, if you want to shoot an email, I will type an answer here to send you an email address. Shoot me an email to, somebody asked if they could get the slide deck. Shooting you this email into the Q&A. If folks want to drop me an email, I'm happy to shoot you a PDF of our slide deck today as well.
We have any other questions?
Yeah.
So happy that folks are around. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We'll give it a minute or so.
while if folks are typing questions, I do want to say, like, to kind of pull this together, we view the feedback loop as a really core aspect of really connecting with communities. And like, we're excited to share this data with you, but we're also excited to share this model with folks. I think we firmly believe that the more folks who are engaging authentically with folks in their communities, the better. We've tried to share kind of our methodology of how we went about setting this up. If folks have questions about how they could like look at collecting similar data, let us know. We're happy to talk about how we can share what we've learned in this process with you as well.
And I think this also becomes important in light of what just happened this week with Joe Biden naming Kamala as his running mate. I think there's a lot of folks that are certainly excited about a ticket and the opportunity to have, you know, first African-American woman as vice president, first woman as vice president. So yes, I think there are a lot of people that are excited about that, but we've also seen that there are a number of different groups, demographic groups that still are not as excited about this ticket as we would like them to be. So something like the feedback loop is an opportunity for us to, again, to talk to these folks about issues and then figure out how we can connect those issues to the candidates so that they can see that these folks are the right option in terms of their ability to maybe push forward some of these issues that our voters care about so much, and our ability to hold them accountable, which has been tough with this president and this Senate. The question in the chat box, are these issues you plan to prioritize discussing with voters based on these responses? Yes, John can certainly speak to this, but the idea is yes, we want to go back and speak to individual voters, or if we see a trend in the region, we want to be able to speak directly to that issue. I can tell you as a kid from Philadelphia, and someone that's kind of hopped around state to state from campaigns, but has never done a campaign in Michigan, to hear that auto insurance was a top 5 issue in Detroit was just shocking to me. And our ability to actually speak to that in real time, along with infrastructure improvements in Michigan, was something that really helped us in our communications with voters. So yes, we certainly want to do that.
And I would also say that, just adding on top of that, there's stuff that we want to speak to. There's also, we view this as ways that we can make our content more engaging as well. As we reach out to folks in multiple channels, we can scale that up by referencing the issues that folks are naming and continuing to have deep connections with folks as an organization. So as we're doing more digital work, making sure that we're referencing the issues that folks are naming, making sure that we're finding content that appeals to them. But then also, as we see new issues pop up, that may also lead to us wanting to go deeper with certain segments of voters and talk about how that issue is showing up in their communities also.
Right, and again, canary in the coal mine, like if we see issues that we feel like the larger community is missing, we want to be able to share that with the community, folks that are on the C4 PAC side. If we see that the enthusiasm is just not there with certain demographic groups, we want to make sure that we are raising the red flag for anyone and everyone so that we can all focus our resources, whether it's folks telling us about their messaging to particular demographic groups or just their interaction or how they may have been able to persuade and motivate. We want to be able to share that with the larger community. Will Justin Zorg be accepting folks to help with poll monitors? I am nervous. Yes, we are all very worried about what's going to happen the day of election. I believe there's an organization called Power the Polls, and we are actually going to be speaking to them on Monday. We ourselves probably will not have volunteers shift to poll workers. We want to make sure that all of our volunteers and our staff focusing on turning out the vote on election day. What I will say though is we're in talks right now to figure out how we can use the push for poll workers as an organizing opportunity, so that when we are calling voters and talking to them, we can also mention that there is a need for some support at the polls. Would you be interested in figuring out how to push folks there that are interested? So yeah, feel free to email us if you have a question about that. Hopefully you live in one of our states and we can be helpful with connecting you to the people that want to do that poll work. What is going on with younger non-voters? How are you reaching them? Non-registered.
I can speak to that a little bit, actually. I think, as Justin said, we're really leaned into vote by mail, and as part of that, we're really focused on how are we providing folks with information on how to vote and how to connect with how to vote this cycle. So as part of that, we're launching hubs for vote by mail applications that also can support folks getting registered. To do that work, we're also going to be doing targeted digital ads And we're not just looking at the voter file for that targeting. And so we're really looking at how do we engage with folks who aren't showing up on the file in the ways that we would traditionally would with, let's say, a DOORS program. We also have partnerships with analytics firms around how are we like understanding who might be in these communities who are not registered. And we are factoring that into our thinking in a number of different ways. A lot of that, we can take advantage of some of the non-face-to-face organizing methods we have right now to really lean into ways that we can reach folks through non-addressable work and drive them into places where they can learn more about how to register, how to vote, and how to get engaged. Justin, anything you want to add on to that? Yeah, so many young voters are not aware that they need to re-register where they now live. Yeah, and I think that's exactly the piece with this vote with our push to vote. I mean, part of that is a voter education piece. Part of that is like, here are the steps that need to happen, making sure that our folks are trained on walking folks through those steps, providing them with the resources. You know, in many of our states, same-day registration is now an option, and it's a super easy way to make sure that you're on the rolls and are going to get that ballot. And so, absolutely. And we also partner with organizations like NextGen who really focus on youth organizing to make sure that like we have a cohesive and efficient plan to reach out to those folks. And we really lean on those experts on youth organizing as well.
And I also just wanted to name another organization, Alliance for Youth Action, is also very good at this as well. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us, hopefully folks in the chat room, it's really important that we try to figure out how we can share information and fill each other's gaps. We're working actively to do that everywhere that we can with organizations like NextGen, Youth Action Alliance, and again, any organizations that frankly are better messengers with certain demographic groups. We want to make sure that we're all setting each other to succeed here, because we just can't lose in November. I think we all realize that.
That's right. If there are no other questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. I think I will also shoot my email out in the chat here. If folks do have questions about anything we talked about here or want to connect at all, drop me a line. And happy to answer any additional questions. Thank you all so much for taking the time to attend this today. We hope it's been helpful for you. Our final message is listen to the people you're talking to, make sure you're capturing that and include it in your organizing. Thank you all so much for being here, and have a great day.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.